speaker will be Ye, Professor Tao from Rowland.
Not professor.
Not yet. Not yet. Okay. Not yet.
Not yet.
No, I won't reveal your career plans. Rowland Institute at Harvard. The Tao Lab seeks structure-property relationships in nanoscale heterogeneous matter through the development of single-nucleon MRI, right? Learning in fundamental atomistic processes using suspended silicon nanowires. So, yeah?
All right, thanks for the introduction. And I'd like to thank Park Systems, K-Bach, Debbie, and everybody here for inviting us to this wonderful conference, the caliber of which far exceeded our expectations. So, so that's Rowland Institute. I guess I will start by telling everybody a little bit about the Institute. It's kind of required by our director every time we come out to give a speech. So for people who have been to Harvard, you probably recognize this building because as a tourist, that's like one of the places you have to visit. That's Harvard Science Center. And that's our building, the Rowland Institute at Harvard. We only became part of the university in the early 2000s. Actually, we're not even on campus. We're much closer to MIT than to Harvard. And at a certain point, we were deciding which one we wanted to join. But anyways, so the founder of the institute, Dr. Edwin Land, who donated money to build both buildings, his family decided after he passed away to make Rowland Institute part of Harvard. So right now, basically what we do is that we have roughly 10 independent PI, junior PI positions, and we take about 2 new PIs per year, recruiting from all areas of science, but we do have a preference for funding projects that's instrumentation development oriented. And currently we have experimental neuroscience, building tracking microscopes to look at fish and monitor their neural firing with single cell resolution as they freely swim. We also look at microbiome interactions, exploiting microfluidics and nanotechnology in general. And for the past 2 years, our recruiting has been targeting renewable energy and energy applications using, for example, nanoscale material, but not necessarily. There's also crazy proposals of studying how sea organisms swim in order to harvest energy from the ocean, for example. So anything wild ideas, basically. So especially for the young people in the audience. So if we encourage you to look us up to consider applying as a PI or as a postdoc. All right, so obviously we can't talk about the institute for the whole day. So there needs to be some science, in the menu. And actually, there's also going to be engineering that we'll be talking about. And the reason is obvious for people in this audience. There's usually cross-fertilization and mutual, beneficial interaction between the two fields or efforts. And because it's a scanning probe conference, the example in engineering that I will use is an example from scanning probe microscopy, specifically ultrasensitive force detection. And the scientific part is something that's my lab, and we don't really have much experience working on, but it just so happens that one of the processes we developed was suited for answering a particular question in this area. So it's the first time I'm presenting this, and it's unpublished. And also, 2 of my students are here, and they will also be presenting exclusively unpublished results because it's only been like a year since we're up and running. So this audience doesn't really need introduction to this paper, so I'll just skip, and has already been mentioned in previous talks. But we all know that the technique is very powerful, and over the years, there's been great progress in achieving subatomic resolution and also amazing frame rates with optimized instrumentation. And also, the same instrument can operate in multiple modes. As a simple example, over here, you can pick out topography versus magnetic ordering. In this case, instead of lifting as in MFM, you're actually approaching further into the sample to look at exchange interaction between your tip atom and the sample. That didn't work. All right, so all the, actually that did work. These techniques are very amazing, but they're mostly reflecting structural information that's 2D or 2D projections in 2D. So it would be quite amazing if we can, for example, develop a force microscope that can probe structure in 3D. And the ideal microscope should have 3D imaging resolution below surface, sub-angstrom spatial resolution to be able to individually tell where each atom is, and be able to work on a single copy of the sample, which was made quite clear, this capability that's going to be very important for troubleshooting FinFETs, for example. And you want to have a chemical contrast and be able to tell different isotopes apart, and of course, be able to look at everything, if possible, at all. And there were some very smart people very soon after AFM got developed that proposed that you can exploit the magnetic properties of many isotopes and nuclei in order to potentially perform this kind of measurement. And the transduction mechanism from the phenomena to a force signal would be long-range magnetic forces, specifically magnetic dipole gradient force between the sample, the atoms, and some external magnetic field gradient source that you would microfabricate. OK, so in principle, it should work. But when one does the calculations using the best available nanoscale magnets, one gets a number like 10 to the minus 19 Newton. That's 100 Zeptonewton, which is about 10 orders of magnitude lower than what commercial AFM typically operate at. And that's using the best magnets produced in a group of Professor John Moreau, who will be speaking afterwards, and my former PhD advisor, Professor Christian Dagan at ETH. So basically, in order to realize this scientific dream of having this instrument to perform wonderful science, it boils down to an engineering challenge of accessing force sensors that can give you this level of force sensitivity. So I will talk a little bit about what people have done in academia to make Zeptonewton force sensors. So there are several directions that people have gone into. A first example is to just use material engineering. For example, this is, I think it's an AFM image of a carbon nanotube suspended between two electrodes. And you can imagine this thing has a very small mass, right? So then having a very small mass, it would be perturbed a lot by forces when it's suspended. And when it's vibrating, then you can use a frequency modulation to make the sensitivity even better. And people also used single crystal diamond to make conventional cantilever beams. And it turns out like carbon is a pretty good material in its different allotrophic forms. And it's possible to achieve very exquisite tens to hundreds of Zeptonewton sensitivity using these structures based on an approach using materials engineering. Another direction people have tried is to do structural engineering using more conventional materials. So these examples are patterned suspended films or strings of silicon nitride. I think it's a LPCVD silicon nitride. And by patterning periodic or aperiodic structures, holes, or defects into the membrane or the string, one can confine the relevant phonon mode in the center of the structure, so preventing the energy from leaking out into the substrate. And these devices have achieved record mechanical quality factor in, I think now it's billion or trillion mechanical quality factor, really amazing. And of course, another branch of physics, they love levitating particles, for example, by radiation forces. And these particles, because they're like single particle, very small mass again, and they're also decoupled from the environment, mechanically at least, they also have amazing force sensitivities. But for application in scanning probe experiments, these approaches, the suspended, doubly clamped or membrane structures, they're very difficult to implement, right? Where do you put the tip, and how do you approach your sample to such delicate structures? So this guy is several millimeters long, but 20 nanometers thick. So I talked to a person who worked on the project, and they say, if you just, somebody across the room sneezed, then your month of work would be like trashed. So they're challenging to use in real applications. So in our lab, and in collaboration with my former PhD advisor, we thought, well, let's do something that's in between. We engineer conventional material like diamond or silicon. We use pretty much a conventional cantilever geometry, but we take most of the mass out by just leaving a ladder structure. And in the fabrication, we had to make them doubly clamped in order for them to survive all the harsh fabrication process. But in the end, we can cut it either using micromanipulator or helium-ion FIB, whichever so you choose. And then they will be singly clamped cantilever that can be operated in pendulum mode to do scanning. So in the process of developing this fabrication, we learned how to suspend delicate structures on wafer scale. And this engineering advance will be what motivates the scientific part of my talk today. But now let's just look at the inspiration for this project in making the ladders. So it's basically an idea that's inspired by macroscopic ladders, because they're very stable, but still lightweight. And during the initial inception of the project, we thought that one advantage of a double nanowire clamped by like rungs is that it eliminates another lateral degree of freedom to make it perhaps easier to control and operate and do feedback on. But the field has since realized that actually there are advantages in having both modes, but we won't get into that today. But when we started the project, that was the initial thought behind it. And Dr. Ying Pan, who's working with me as a postdoc, developed a wafer scale fabrication of these things. And that's an example of one chip you can break out from your AFM chip, containing multiple devices of these nano ladder resonators. So now let's talk about the scientific part. It's a solid charge transfer reaction. So charge transfer is very important for all branches of energy conversion engineering and science. They exist in nature. That's how solar energy gets converted to a chemical field in the end. It goes through multiple electron transfer reactions. And in artificial systems, to capture energy, and also to store energy captured from the sun into chemicals or fuels or hydrogen or ethylene. Like right now, there's very high efficiency electrocatalysts to convert CO2, for example, to ethylene with about 90-something% Coulombic efficiency. And in all of these processes, the movement of electrons across interfaces between molecules, between electrodes, and chemicals are very important, and it's an omnipresent phenomenon. So the basic mechanism of this process has been studied since more than half a century, using many model systems. But so far, most of the model systems have what I would consider a homogenized geometry. meaning that the effective distance between the donor and acceptor is pretty much averaged over from ensemble point of view, either through just rapid motion, mostly through rapid motion, as in the case of solution phase reaction between ions. And people also have tethered donor-acceptor pairs using a rigid organic molecule, and by varying the number of repeating units, systematically increasing this parameter, the distance between the two, basically the width of the barrier. And one can also study the transfer process between electrodes and a molecule, but also using a very controlled self-assembled monolayer to precisely control that distance. And of course, in the scanning probe community, using atomic force feedback or tunneling feedback, one can also very nicely control that distance to achieve what I'm calling here homogenized geometry. And the conclusion from all of these studies that span more than half a century is that the first order reaction, the rate constant for that transfer process, K electron transfer, is pretty much a tunneling phenomenon, and that the rate decays exponentially as the distance between the donor and acceptor with some parameter beta. What about in the case of heterogeneous engineering systems? That's what people usually deal with in actual devices. For example, in the charging of iron phosphate with lithium, one applies a negative potential to some carbon overcoating, and that would drive, say, the migration of positive lithium ions into the lattice, and then the electron can then jump to an iron 3 or iron 2 to make an iron 2. And the pair that's formed, like there are several here that are depicted, is called a polaron, and that thing can migrate into the lattice. So obviously, that's a very complex multi-step process. So the question is, which transfer step is actually the rate-limiting one? I'm not in the field, but just from reading the field literature, it seems like there's a debate in the field as to whether it's a lithium migration or electron transfer that constitutes the rate-limiting step. So these people did some chronoamperometry experiment. Basically, they change in a stepwise fashion the voltage applied to the electrode and watch how the current change over time and extract a rate constant from it. And they plot the result as a function of the overpotential difference applied to the electrode. So one very striking feature immediately is that there's very little, what seems to be very little temperature dependence of the process, which the authors suggest is indicative that lithium diffusion is not rate limiting, because that would be a very highly temperature dependent process. And the other piece of evidence they invoked was that the data could be very nicely fit to models based on electron transfer. So the conclusion from this study was that electron transfer was the rate limiting step in this particular process. But then there's also journals that, while they do not disprove this model, they also restate the fact that the exact process remains to be further explored, and there needs to be further study for a system as complex as this. So it seems like analyses of individual elementary steps, either the transfer of lithium or just the transfer of the electron, would be important in teasing apart the multiple pathways that exist in such kind of systems. So that's a nanoscale phenomenon, electron transfer. So it's probably best to study using nanoscale tools or devices. And today we heard many talks on the field effect transistor. And viewed from the point of view of a sensor, this thing basically reports a variation of some voltage through a current signal. We can also conceptually replace this gate voltage with some kind of phenomena, physical phenomena or chemical phenomena that gives you some effective gate voltage. And then consider it this way, then the device becomes a sensor for whatever phenomena you're trying to probe. And in the sensor community, at least in the past like 20 years or so, this basic idea has been applied to carbon nanotube sensors to look at gas absorption. And also in Charles Lieber's group, it's been used to monitor the pH change in solution. And in the case of charge transfer, I think it's even a better sensor because the phenomena you are trying to probe is the change of, for example, the density of carriers in the device. So I mentioned that we learned how to make these suspended single crystal structures of nanowires. And why not just make an array of them and use them as the actual sensor for this charge transfer doping process? So we suspend them. So in analogy to FinFET, where you want to expose maximize your area that's in contact with the gate, I think it would be nice to fully release them from the substrate so that the process can happen all around it. And it's nice to make them very thin. So in the end, they're basically suspended silicon surfaces. And that's ideal for investigating interface phenomena. So we made those devices. We condensed cobaltocene, which is the electron donor, onto the devices at low temperature under UHV conditions. And we just followed the conductivity of these wires in time. So to make sure that things make sense, most sensitive or most a parameter that should lead to the most sensitive response in the system is the separation in distance between your donor and the acceptor. So donor in this case is the molecule that's yielding the electron to the silicon sensor, which is also the acceptor. And the way we achieved that experimentally was by using surface chemistry, gas phase chemistry that we developed actually for making cantilevers more sensitive. We applied the same chemistry to the silicon nanowire sensors. So one surface was just, everybody knows, hydrogen terminated surface. Another one was a silicon propanol surface. And the structure are like mixtures of different geometries because you can never get homogeneous chemical structure on something with the extent of surface roughness that we see on those nanowires. But the qualitative trend is quite clear in that by increasing the separation between the two, the rate and also the extent of direction of this process goes down dramatically as you increase the spacing. So we wanted to get some more quantitative understanding of these curves. So as any scientist would do, after getting data like that, we try to impose an exponential fit. But obviously, there's some deviations. And if we think about what's happening at the surface, the sensor surface is going to be rough. And there will be distributions of distance between the dopant and the core. So to first approximation, let's say that the probability density for finding the dopant is like some constant function that starts from some value d naught. That's how close the thing can approach to some final d naught plus L. That's the thickness of the dopant layer that you put. Then you will have some populations that are closer that react with a higher rate, and populations that are further that react with a slower rate. And over here, the faster population and slower population would be represented by those deviations from the simple exponential model. So we developed a model based on the simple idea of a continuous distribution of rates, and the result was quite in agreement with the data. So what does the model entail? So the plot, the curve here, is basically the evolution of the population of electrons as a function of time. And that's given by a factor C0. That's the total population that's the electron transfer active on your surface times 1 minus the fraction that's still able to react. And that's simply, that thing decays exponentially, but weighted by the reaction rates of that particular distance. And so that's just to let people know what equation were used in this curve. And there's only actually 2 fit-in parameters, the same number as a simple exponential fit. And the model was used to fit all data sets in a study and was found to be in quantitative agreement with the data. And from those fitting parameters, we could extract the reorganizational energy of this charge transfer reaction, and also we uncovered a thermal activation effect of a population of charge transfer active species that's a function of the temperature. And with that, I'd like to thank my team at Rowland Institute, the collaborators, and you for your attention.
We'll take one question for Ye. Then go to. Yes, Dr. Wang.
When you first started talking about the charge transfer, the barrier is a carbon, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And later on, when you gave us the example, you have the cantilever single crystal.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the barrier now? There's no barrier?
In the carbon, I think it's more like an interface, because the charges are residing in the carbon electrode. So it's, I guess, from the last atom of that carbon material to the iron, the nearest iron 3 ion. And the barrier would be whatever liquid or molecule that's inside. And in the case of the sensor, the barrier is either just the silicon-hydrogen bond or silicon carbon-carbon-carbon hydrogen bond. So the barrier is some fixed number of covalent bonds.
Okay, let's thank Dr. Tower again.